For how many people is the first reaction to our reading this morning from the Gospel of John to look at it and say, aha, I knew it? This story from the Gospel of John is about, or at least appears to be about, the whole question about whether or not we ought to give money and resources to the poor. And you know what? I suspect that a lot of people, and I'm not necessarily talking about people out there in the sanctuary or people watching over Zoom or YouTube, but I'm talking about people in the world at large for sure. They do not really want to see their hard-earned money going to support the poor. They don't want to see it taken for taxes and spent on things like welfare. They don't want to give money to feed or clothe or help the poor either. I mean, it's their money. They'd kind of like to keep it. I think this is really not an unusual sentiment, but it's also not one that many people really want to own. I mean, nobody wants to seem unkind or cheap or cruel towards the poor. And so, of course, we've got to find a reason not to give. We've got to find a rationalization. And our reading from the Gospel of John this morning seems to offer two rationalizations. They are the main ones, in fact, that people offer. One comes to us from Judas Iscariot, of all people. The other one comes from Jesus. So let's look at these two biblical reasons not to give for the poor. When Mary comes in, and she begins to lavish this expensive perfume all over Jesus, pouring it out so wantonly that the scent of it fills the entire room, it is Judas who brings up the topic of giving to the poor. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor? He cries out to poor Mary. And the first problem with that is, well, obviously the spokesman. It doesn't really seem like a very good endorsement to have the suggestion of giving for the poor put on the lips of the most vile, hateful, despicable character in the entire book. I mean, imagine if Voldemort were to make the suggestion that everyone go down to the beach in a Harry Potter book, or if Pennywise the Clown were to suggest to people, let's go play in the sewers. It doesn't really make for a good endorsement, right? When the villain tells you to do it. So, when we hear Judas make the suggestion of giving to the poor, it really doesn't seem to make giving to the poor a very good option. But of course, it's even worse than that, because we are also told what Judas's motivations were. He said this not because he cared about the poor, the gospel writer tells us, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. And this is, in fact, the number one excuse that people offer for why they don't want to give to the poor. They are convinced that there must be theft involved somehow. And that's where such people look at this passage and they say, aha, I knew it. This is an assumption that you always run into when you are involved in helping out those who are living in the margins of society. There are always stories and suspicions of people stealing, which is to say, of people getting benefits that they are not entitled to or that they don't use in the ways that we want. We run into that here in our work at St. Andrew's Hespeler. There are accusations or suspicions of people taking, for example, more clothes than they can use from Hope Clothing and then selling them on Kijiji or something. People also often make observations on the lifestyle of the people who come out. Maybe they observe that they are driving a car that seems like it's in too good a condition or probably costs too much. There are also comments when people have expensive habits like, well, smoking. The argument seems to go that if there are some who don't look or act poor enough or who use the resources in ways that we don't like, well, that's stealing. And it invalidates the entire exercise, even if it's only a small percentage of people who are doing it. We also see the same argument employed on a much larger scale at those large-scale efforts at alleviating poverty. Welfare programs, for example, are often cut back based on accusations of things like people using drugs or not wanting to work. In a number of jurisdictions, drug testing measures and rigorous requirements for people searching for work have been put into place. And of course, I'm not saying that there should be no restrictions or no regulations on people accessing these programs. I mean, and obviously it's not sufficient for us to provide monetary support without also offering tools and assistance for those who need help figuring out how to support themselves. But when we get into punitive measures being put into place because of a perception that our generosity leads to theft, these have generally failed. Programs, for example, that required drug testing for those to receive welfare have been largely a failure. The number of positive tests have been ridiculously low, and the programs certainly did not save money. They made the whole program cost a lot more. All of that makes me feel that this tendency to suggest that programs to help the poor are ridden with theft are not really about a concern for theft, but rather a way of justifying not doing anything at all. So that's the first rationalization, the accusation of theft. And we need to be wary of it. The second rationalization is also found in this gospel passage. What's more, it is Jesus who says it this time. "Leave her alone," Jesus replies to Judas. "She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." And I know exactly how a lot of people have interpreted that saying of Jesus. What they understand Jesus to be saying there is that it's okay for money not to be given to the poor because the problem of poverty will not just go away. They take it to mean that you shouldn't give money to help the poor because the problem of poverty is intractable. And that quickly becomes an excuse not to do anything at all for the poor, and it seems to have Jesus' endorsement not to do anything. But is that what Jesus is saying in this passage? Not really. One of the main reasons why I know that, I know it for sure, is because this saying does not have its origins with Jesus. What Jesus is actually doing here is he's quoting. He is quoting an Old Testament passage that is found in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 11, where Moses says, "Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land." And when Jews like Jesus did that, when they quoted one line from the scriptures, they did it with an expectation. They expected that their fellow Jewish listeners and readers would recognize the quote, and that they would go back and read or try and understand the larger context of the quote. So, when Jesus quotes this passage from Deuteronomy, he does not expect the disciples to take that quote all alone. He expects them to go back and see what Moses was talking about around that quote. And that passage in Deuteronomy is a description of a specific law called the Sabbath year law. It was a series of measures that were to be taken every 7 years that included things like canceling debts, giving freedom to those who had been sold into slavery because of their debts, and other measures. The Sabbath year law was a series of measures that were intended to address the systemic problems in the economy and in the society that tended to push people into a state of permanent poverty from which they could find no way out. And the evidence seems to indicate that this law, the Sabbath year law, and other laws like it, were still very active in the popular imagination in Jesus' time. That is because there was a general awareness of systemic issues in that society. There were things going on like inflation, it's unfamiliar, and income inequality, and the structure of taxation that were making it impossible for large portions of the population to escape from endless cycles of poverty. And so Jesus, by directing the disciples' attention towards this law, is saying that it's actually important to know how we should address these systemic issues of poverty. Jesus is pointing out that there is a problem with focusing only on giving money or doing things like running food banks or giving clothing away. I mean, yes, charity is essential. It is really important when people can't feed or clothe their children. But it doesn't solve the problems behind that poverty. Most of that has to do with the system, the way the society, the way the economy has been set up, political policies that are in place. Well, the ancient law of the Sabbath year was an effort to address systemic issues in society. Now, that's not to say that the ancient law was a perfect tool to address such issues, nor is it to say that the ancient law would actually work in our modern society and economy. In fact, I'm pretty sure that those specific measures wouldn't work today. They would probably make things much worse. So it's not the specific policies, but the principle that is important here, that it is not enough just to give to the poor without addressing those systemic issues. We have been truly blessed in this congregation and in the church in general to be able to reach out in compassion and love and support for those who are really struggling to get by. It's a privilege to have that kind of ministry. But there is a danger that comes with such a ministry. And the danger is that we fail to look at the bigger picture. And if we really care about the poor, we need to be advocating for policies that address the systemic issues in society. We would become involved in pressing for changes in things like how people are compensated, how people are respected in their work, housing policy, which is really huge right now. We should be involved in addressing issues of income and wealth disparity. And I realize, of course, that some of that is problematic for a church where we do not want to become directly involved in partisan politics. We are not in a position where we can or should be endorsing a specific party's policy about any of these things. But none of that should get in the way of us speaking out and informing ourselves as citizens about the systemic issues that affect the whole of society. I think it's important that we understand, therefore, that what Jesus is saying is that as good as giving to the poor is, it cannot be our whole response. We need to look at the bigger picture. And maybe a really good image for what we should be doing about poverty is to be found in this woman, Mary, and her jar of expensive perfume. The perfume is costly, of course. And yes, the money could have been used to support many struggling families. But what does she do with it? I think it's rather significant that the gospel writer does point out something she accomplishes with her perfume. He tells us that the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. He notes that she literally changed the atmosphere in that house. And I think that's something we need to aspire to. We need to address the problem of poverty in society by changing the atmosphere. Yes, there will always be excuses and justifications for not giving to those who are in need. The accusation of theft is, yes, a handy excuse. But when we look at it more closely, we recognize that it is often based on misrepresentation. The excuse that poverty is an intractable problem is one that we need to pay more attention to. We need to look at what Jesus is saying in this passage, and we need to find ways to balance our need to respond to the immediate problems with the imperative of addressing larger issues in society and the way that society is structured and the way the economy is structured by changing the atmosphere, the way that we and others think about the system and how it needs to work. Lord, the poor are still with us, and the problems of poverty seem to be on the rise, as many are finding it hard to cope. Thank you for the blessing of having a ministry of reaching out to those in need. But let us not forget to look at those wider, larger, systemic issues and seek solutions that change the atmosphere. Amen.